The courtroom was cloaked in a dense, oppressive silence, so thick it felt as if it weighed upon your lungs, turning each breath into an effort. The room was packed, every seat occupied, with all attention directed towards the figure at the heart of the scene. Seated in a wheelchair, Sergeant Liam Bennett wore his military dress, his chest adorned with shining medals that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting. His hand tightly held the leash of his companion, Apollo, a German shepherd whose serene yet vigilant presence contrasted with the tense atmosphere. To the onlookers, Apollo might appear to be just another service dog, but to Liam, he was much more than that. He was kin. Liam's jaw clenched as the judge began to address him, signaling that this moment might be his last opportunity to make his case. The military had ruled that Apollo, regarded as government property, was needed for another assignment. After years of serving side by side, facing life-threatening situations together, the notion of parting ways with Apollo now seemed like an unfathomable treachery. Liam's fingers quivered as he tightened his hold on the leash. Struggling to maintain a steady voice, he addressed the court. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Apollo is more than just a tool of the military. He has saved my life in ways that are incomprehensible to anyone outside of our bond. In combat, he dragged me out of harm's way, protected me from bullets, and alerted me to hidden dangers before I could detect them. Back home, when I struggled to even look at myself, Apollo stood by me. He was my reason to persevere. Please, don't separate us." The courtroom was enveloped in a palpable stillness, charged with silent empathy. Some in the audience dabbed at their eyes, while others shared looks of both pity and indignation. The judge remained expressionless, his gaze fixed on Liam as he leaned forward, poised to issue his decision. However, before he could speak, an unexpected interruption occurred. Apollo suddenly stood up, pulling the leash from Liam's shaking hands. He approached the judge, barking sharply, his calls resonating across the room. The assembly inhaled sharply in surprise, and the bailiff moved forward reflexively. Although Apollo displayed no aggression, his barks were insistent and meaningful, as if he were desperately trying to convey an urgent message. "Apollo!" Liam's voice cracked as he called out, overwhelmed with a mix of fear and recognition. He knew this behavior all too well from their time in combat together. Apollo wasn't just causing a disturbance, he was issuing a warning. The murmurs in the courtroom intensified as someone from the back row whispered, "What's wrong with the dog?" Liam felt a tightness in his chest as he pushed his wheelchair forward, his voice shaking as he explained, "He's not just barking. He does this only when he senses danger. He's trying to alert us to something." The judge, who had been ready to deliver his ruling, paused and set aside his gavel, his gaze fixed intently on Apollo. Silence reclaimed the room, punctuated only by Apollo's urgent barks, which reverberated like a warning drum. Apollo's alert was not solely for Liam's sake. The dog had perceived a threat that remained unseen to everyone else in the courtroom. For the first time that day, a glimmer of hope sparked within Liam. This moment transcended a simple farewell. It was the precursor to a significant revelation, with Apollo at the helm, compelling everyone to take notice. The courtroom fell utterly quiet, save for the sharp, resonant barks from Apollo. Each bark echoed off the dark, polished wooden walls, slicing through the heavy air of anticipation. Apollo's body was poised in alert, with his ears drawn back and his eyes steadfastly fixed on the area near the judge. As Liam gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his attention was riveted on Apollo, waiting anxiously to see what the dog's instincts had detected. This behavior from Apollo was clearly not mere disturbance. His body language signaled a specific alert. Liam felt his heart race, an adrenaline surge reminiscent of his time in combat zones. Yet this was a courtroom, a realm of order and civility, not a battlefield. "Apollo, heel!" Liam commanded, his voice firm but laced with tremors. Apollo cast a brief, sharp look back at Liam, almost reassuring him of his control over the situation, before refocusing his attention on the judge's bench. He began pacing with short, deliberate steps, his growls deepening into a resonant threat that echoed around the room. The audience's murmurs turned into uneasy whispers, their initial sympathy for Liam shifting into a palpable tension. "Mr. Bennett," the judge spoke up, irritation tinged in his voice. "Control your dog, or I will have to." "Your Honor," Liam interrupted, his voice growing louder and more assertive despite the tightness in his chest. "Apollo isn't just acting out. He's trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, signs of danger. He wouldn't react like this without a real reason." The room hushed once more, Liam's assertion casting a wave of dread across the gathered crowd. Just as the tension reached its peak, Apollo abruptly ceased his barking. The sudden silence felt almost louder than his previous alarms. He stood stock still, his body tensed as he focused intently towards the courtroom's rear. His ears pricked up, and a low, ominous growl vibrated through him. This dramatic shift in his demeanor caused even the judge to halt, stunned into stillness. All eyes instinctively turned towards the grand wooden doors at the back of the courtroom, the air thick with anxiety as whispers grew into a cacophony of concerned voices. Liam's breath quickened as he tuned into Apollo's intense focus. His heart pounded loudly, mirroring the moments in combat when Apollo had alerted him to hidden explosives or imminent ambushes. Now, in the stark silence of the courtroom, that same behavior meant an imminent threat was near. "Apollo!" Liam's whisper cracked with urgency. "What is it?" Apollo remained immobile, his body a statue of tension, his growl deepening, a sonic warning that vibrated ominously through the courtroom. The danger, Liam realized, wasn't confined to him alone. It was a threat to everyone present. Apollo's menacing growl echoed like distant thunder, anchoring the attention of everyone in the room. His body was rigid, eyes fixed on the courtroom's heavy wooden doors, and even the judge, who had been ready to chastise Liam, looked visibly shaken. His gavel was idle, forgotten, as he shared a look of disquiet with the bailiffs. The atmosphere was charged, the air dense with an unspoken dread. Liam's breathing escalated, his hands clenching the wheelchair's armrests tightly as if preparing for an impact. His experience in war had taught him to trust Apollo's instincts implicitly. The dog's alert had always been a precursor to danger, imminent and unavoidable. "Keep your cool," Liam whispered to himself, though the reassurance rang empty. The close-knit group, uncertain of their next move, paused near the judge's bench. One, a large man with a cautious look, took a hesitant step forward, his hand lightly touching the gun at his side. "It's just a dog, isn't it?" he said softly, his voice revealing his nervousness. "Maybe it's just spooked by the noise or the people." Yet, as he moved, his steps were measured, his actions thoughtful. Liam shook his head, his voice gaining enough strength to pierce the low buzz of the crowd. "No, Apollo isn't bothered by noise or crowds. He's trained to detect threats we can't perceive. Believe me, if he's growling, there's a good reason for it." His statement lingered, freezing everyone in place. The judge, clearly disturbed, gave a nod to the bailiffs, signaling them to check the door. Apollo's growl deepened as the bailiffs neared the door. The larger man tentatively reached out, his fingers wrapping around the cold metal handle. The courtroom held its collective breath for a moment. Liam's heart raced as he observed, every fiber of his being tensed in anticipation. Apollo's stance was unyielding, his growls escalating to sharp, quick barks as the door began to inch open. It creaked to reveal the shadowy hallway beyond, which at first glance appeared vacant. However, Apollo's continued barking, his gaze locked on something unseen, suggested otherwise. The burly bailiff stepped into the dim corridor, his hand never straying from his sidearm. He looked back towards the courtroom, his complexion ghostly, then faced forward once more. Moments later, his voice shattered the quiet. "Something's here." Liam's heartbeat accelerated as he leaned forward, tension constricting his chest. Whatever the bailiff glimpsed had set Apollo's instincts ablaze. Liam knew well that Apollo's reactions were infallibly precise. The atmosphere in the courtroom thickened, tension seeming to drain the oxygen from the space. Apollo's barking abruptly halted, each bark echoing off the wood-paneled walls. His form was a portrait of alertness. Muscles coiled, head lowered, eyes intensely focused on the shadowed hallway beyond the open door. The larger bailiff, his unease palpable, took another cautious step into the hallway, his boots making soft clicks against the tile. His hand hovered near his weapon, his posture taut as if bracing for an unseen attack. "What is happening out there?" demanded the judge, his voice breaking slightly despite efforts to sound authoritative. He clutched his gavel, his knuckles whitening as his gaze flicked anxiously between the doorway and Apollo. The dog's growl deepened into a low, menacing rumble that resonated through the courtroom, sending chills through all who heard it. The larger bailiff turned back toward the courtroom, his expression strained with apprehension. "I can't see anything," he murmured, his voice cautious. "But it feels off." He peered back into the darkened hallway, his expression clouded with doubt, as though trying to dismiss his own uneasy feelings. "It's too quiet." The words slipped out in a hush, yet echoed across the still room like a sharp report. Liam leaned forward in his wheelchair, a familiar dread coiling in his stomach. He recognized those words. Too quiet. A foreboding echo from his days in combat, always a harbinger of looming peril. His voice cut through the growing whisper of the crowd, firm and clear. "Apollo doesn't alert without cause. If he's behaving this way, there's a real threat. We need to evacuate immediately." Liam's order carried an unmistakable urgency, yet the onlookers remained motionless, their fear and confusion rendering them immobile. The smaller bailiff stepped up, pulling a flashlight from his belt and shining it into the corridor. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing the polished floor stretching ahead. "It's empty," he said quietly, though his voice wavered. "Just an empty hallway." His attempt at reassurance was undermined by the slight tremor in his hand. Meanwhile, Apollo was anything but reassured. The dog's growls intensified, his barks growing more desperate as he tugged at the leash, nearly pulling it from Liam's grasp. Then, a sharp metallic clang shattered the tense silence, reverberating down the hallway. The smaller bailiff jerked, his flashlight beam wavering as he instinctively retreated. Apollo surged towards the sound, his barking thunderous, claws screeching against the floor as he fought the leash. The courtroom erupted in gasps, and a wave of panic swept through the assembled crowd. The larger bailiff, responding to instinct, drew his weapon, his voice strained with urgency. "What the hell was that?" Amidst the rising chaos, Liam's voice boomed, edged with a potent mix of fear and conviction. "Pull Apollo back," he commanded, his tone vibrating with intensity. "He's never mistaken. Something is approaching." But before anyone could act, the metallic clang resounded once more, louder and nearer, as though whatever was causing it had moved closer. The atmosphere was heavy, electrified with a palpable tension that sent shivers of dread across the courtroom. The danger Apollo had detected was real, transforming from a possibility to an imminent threat. Again, the metallic sound rang out, sharper and closer still, echoing like a dire warning from the darkened hallway. The atmosphere in the courtroom tightened, a palpable sense of dread enveloping everyone inside. Apollo, the dog, growled fiercely, tugging at his leash as if trying to burst through the door to face whatever menace lay beyond. Liam held the leash firmly, his hands ghostly white and his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it. He too sensed the impending danger. Something was amiss. Something was approaching. The taller officer stepped into the corridor, his weapon at the ready, eyes darting across the dimly lit space. His colleague followed, his flashlight shaking slightly in his grasp. The light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but an empty, silent hallway. Still, Apollo's barks continued, each growl more urgent than the last. Liam felt a primal urge to cry out, to demand an evacuation, but the pervasive fear had already rooted everyone in place. Nobody stirred. "Do you see anything?" asked the judge, his voice breaking as he leaned forward, anxiety etching his face. The gavel in his hand shook subtly, his usual commanding presence now tinged with fear. The officer looked back, his face drained of color, beads of sweat dotting his forehead. "Nothing yet," he replied quietly, tension straining his words. "But something's off." With each cautious step he took, his heavy boots resounded through the corridor. The courtroom buzzed with nervous whispers, with some spectators gripping their belongings tighter and others subtly moving towards the exits. The tension seemed to spread uncontrollably. Liam shifted forward in his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on Apollo, who had fallen silent once more. The dog stood rigid, his ears perked up, his eyes unblinking and aimed at the open doorway. Apollo's sensed something. Liam's voice shook as he spoke. "I can't tell what it is, but it's definitely there." Just then, as the bailiff made his way midway down the hallway, a shadow flickered. It was fleeting and almost missed, yet it sent the smaller officer reeling back, his flashlight's beam darting frantically. "Over there!" he yelled, panic straining his voice. The taller officer stopped dead, his firearm raised toward the enveloping dark. Apollo resumed his barking, pulling so fiercely that Liam almost lost his hold. "Move back!" Liam cried out, his voice booming across the courtroom. "Get out now!" The judge pounded his gavel, attempting to restore order, but his efforts were lost amidst the escalating uproar. Spectators were now standing, their murmurs escalating into shouts as fear took over. Then, emerging from the shadowy hallway, came another sound, a slow, measured step. It wasn't fast, it wasn't panicked, it was deliberate, and it was drawing nearer. Apollo growled menacingly, his teeth bared, muscles straining against the leash as if ready to charge. A wave of terror washed over Liam, his heart sinking. Whatever was approaching from the hallway wasn't just coming, it was making its presence known with chilling intentionality. The resounding thud of the footstep reverberated through the courtroom, slicing through the escalating bedlam like a sharp blade. Apollo's fierce snarls dominated the atmosphere, his muscular frame straining against the leash so powerfully that Liam had to brace himself in his wheelchair to prevent being pulled forward. The air was thick with tension, every gaze fixed on the shadowy corridor drawn to the ominous sound that everyone dreaded yet couldn't ignore. "Keep calm, everyone," the judge yelled, slamming his gavel once more, but his words were lost amid the panic. People scrambled to their feet, grabbing at their belongings, their hands, clinging to anything within reach as if it might shield them from the impending danger. The larger officer remained motionless in the hallway, his firearm trained on the engulfing shadows. His partner stood back, the flashlight's beam skittering across the walls, illuminating each crevice but exposing nothing definite. Liam's voice surged above the turmoil. "Get out of there!" he barked, his urgency piercing the confusion. "It's not safe!" Although his warning was sharp, the larger officer seemed rooted to the spot, peering into the gloom with a clenched jaw. Then the shadow shifted unmistakably, slow, calculated, menacing. The smaller officer let out a sharp intake of breath, his flashlight quivering in his shaky grip. "There's someone there," he whispered, his voice trembling. For a fleeting moment, the light revealed a tall, dark figure that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, slipping back into the shadows. A shudder of fear swept through the courtroom. The larger officer tightened his hold on his gun, his voice firm yet subdued. "Show yourself," he demanded, authority resonating in his command. "Step out where I can see you." Yet the reply was only a dense, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. Meanwhile, Apollo's barking escalated, his teeth exposed, his frame tensed and primed to spring forward. Then the inevitable unfolded. The shadowy figure emerged into the light, moving with a slow, almost mocking calmness. A man, his features concealed under a hood, hands buried in the pockets of a bulky coat, stepped forward. His actions were measured, his stance oddly composed despite the turmoil around him. He paused at the very fringe of the flashlight's glow, head cocked slightly as though amused by the unfolding drama. Apollo's growling deepened, his claws scraping against the floor as Liam struggled to restrain him. "Who are you?" the larger bailiff called out, his firearm trained on the shadowy figure. The man remained silent. Instead, he took another deliberate step forward, a faint smirk discernible under the shadow of his hood. Liam's breath hitched, a wave of intense foreboding sweeping over him. There was something profoundly unsettling about the man, not just threatening, but eerily wrong. Slowly, the man raised his hands, a gesture that heightened the tension, causing the officers to tighten their hold on their weapons. "Relax." The man's voice was low, eerily calm, exuding a chilling confidence. "I'm not here to harm anyone." His words, however, hung heavily in the air, sending a chill through the room. Liam sensed the deceit instantly, and Apollo reacted as well, his growling relentless. Silence engulfed the courtroom as the man stood at the corridor's edge, his form partially caught in the trembling light. Apollo's menacing growls filled the space, a deep, resonant sound that underscored the high stakes. The bailiffs gripped their weapons firmly, their hands shaking slightly, betraying their extensive training. Liam's heart pounded as he watched the unknown man. His stance was unnervingly poised, as though he thrived in the discomfort he wrought. "Come forward, but slowly," commanded the towering bailiff, his voice firm with command yet tinged with a trace of anxiety. The hooded figure cocked his head, his face hidden in shadow, and stepped forward. His boots made a soft clink against the tile, each step deliberate and assured, as if he relished the captive audience's gaze. Apollo, Liam's dog, growled and strained at his leash, his claws scratching at the ground. Liam's hands were damp with perspiration as he tightened his hold. "Apollo, stop," he whispered, his voice shaky. "He can tell. He knows something isn't right." His murmurs barely made it past his lips, yet the judge shot him a look, his face a canvas of fear and puzzlement. The shorter BFF moved ahead, his flashlight in one hand, the other poised near his gun. "Sir," he stammered, "please identify yourself now." The mysterious man raised his head, his features partially illuminated under the hood. His eyes were cold and sharp, striking fear into Liam. "I mean no harm," he stated, his tone eerily even and empty. He slowly reached into his coat, prompting the BFFs to tense up and aim their guns higher. Murmurs swept through the courtroom. Someone at the back muttered, "He's reaching for something." The atmosphere was charged, the tension palpable and ready to snap. Liam's gut urged him to take action, yet he stood immobilized, clutching Apollo's leash as if it was his sole link to reality. The stranger's hand withdrew from his pocket, revealing a small metallic object. The bailiffs simultaneously yelled, "Drop it!" The man paused, a slight smirk forming on his lips. "Relax," he said smoothly, lifting the object high. It caught the dim light, turning out to be just a simple key, yet Liam's anxiety intensified. The atmosphere remained thick with tension, no trace of relief or security. Apollo continued to bark sharply, fixated on the man as if the key was merely a ruse. Liam's fingers tightened around the leash, murmuring to himself, "This isn't right. He's concealing something. There's more to this." The stranger's smile grew broader as though he sensed Liam's suspicions, and the air in the room grew heavier with dread. The courtroom seemed on the brink of collapse, every gaze fixed on the man with the key, whose smirk stood in stark contrast to the spreading alarm. Apollo's barks echoed, deep and warning, as if he was alerting them to a danger that was still unseen. Liam's hands shook as he gripped the leash harder, his breathing heavy with the burden of his instincts which screamed above the surrounding turmoil. Something was profoundly amiss. This man represented not just a threat but the harbinger of something far darker and more significant. "Put down the key and step back," the larger bailiff commanded, his voice firm, the gun unwavering in his grip. The smaller bailiff, his face a mask of apprehension, moved closer, his flashlight aimed and steady. Yet the man before them remained calm, his head tilted as his eyes briefly met Apollo's. "That dog," he remarked in a tone that was eerily casual. "He's unique, isn't he? Always aware before anything unfolds. That's his true worth." His words, though spoken softly, carried an unsettling weight, causing a stir of unease to spread through the spectators. Liam felt a sinking feeling. How could this stranger possibly know about Apollo's unique senses? The sensation made the hairs on Liam's neck stand up, prompting him to confront the man. "How do you know about him?" he called out, his voice tinged with both sharpness and a tremble. Apollo, reacting to the tension, barked more fiercely, straining against his leash as if to shield Liam from unseen dangers. The man's smirk only widened, his eyes reflecting a disturbing glee. He slowly lifted the key, his actions tauntingly slow. "Soon, you'll see," he replied, his voice disturbingly confident. Then, with a faint but distinct metallic click, he twisted the key in his hand. The minimal sound belied its significant impact. Apollo's barking escalated into a frantic howl, and before any response could be made, the courtroom lights began to flicker wildly. In the sudden darkness, the room erupted in a cacophony of gasps and shouts, with the scraping of chairs echoing as people stumbled in panic. As the lights stuttered back to life, the stranger stood not alone but flanked by two shadow-like figures emerging from the hallway. Their faces obscured and their movements precise, they radiated a clear threat. Each held a weapon, the metallic edges gleaming ominously under the flickering lights. Liam's pulse hammered as he glanced at Apollo, who emitted a growl so deep and raw it verged on the primal. This situation had escalated far beyond a mere confrontation over a mysterious key. It had unveiled a deeper, more sinister plot. The courtroom was in turmoil, with spectators rushing towards the exits in a blend of confusion and terror, their cries melding with the loud scraping of chairs. The new arrivals advanced further into the room, their daunting presence intensifying the fear that gripped everyone. Apollo's incessant barking and tense posture signaled his readiness to leap into action. Liam clutched the leash tighter, his body coursing with adrenaline, now certain of the grave danger they faced. Apollo was at the center of their intentions. "Please, remain calm." The judge attempted to restore order, pounding his gavel, but his calls were lost amidst the rising wave of panic. The larger bailiff asserted his position, flashlight aimed at the advancing stranger, his voice firm. "Stay right there," he ordered. However, the stranger continued his measured approach, his calm demeanor stark against the backdrop of escalating fear. His companions paced steadily behind him, each step they took heightening the suffocating tension in the courtroom. The outsider finally broke the silence, his tone smooth yet authoritative, slicing through the surrounding clamor. "Let's keep this peaceful. I just want the dog." His delivery was serene, yet there was a commanding undertone that sent a shiver through Liam. Apollo issued a low growl, his intense eyes fixed firmly on the man, unwavering in his posture. Liam's heart thudded violently. "He's not going anywhere with you," he declared, his voice resolute yet tinged with emotion. He edged his wheelchair closer to Apollo, his grip on the leash solid. "He's more than a pet. He's my ally, my family. I don't care about your claims or your sense of entitlement. You're not taking him." The room seemed to pause, hanging on his words. The smirk on the stranger's face disappeared, his eyes narrowing as he observed Liam. "You're complicating things unnecessarily," he retorted, his stare lingering on Apollo with a slight flicker of irritation. "He's exceptional, and you know it, but keeping him will only bring you trouble." Liam clenched his jaw, his hold on the leash tightening. "Apollo is staying with me," he stated emphatically, his voice steady. The murmurs around them grew louder, a mix of pleas for peace and hushed tones of apprehension about the unfolding situation. The air was thick with tension, every second elongating into what felt like forever. Suddenly, Apollo barked sharply, cutting through the tension and refocusing everyone's attention. His gaze on the stranger was laser-focused, as though he fully grasped the gravity of the moment. Liam's heart clenched as he leaned forward in his wheelchair, braced to defend the one true companion who had never failed him. Despite the unclear motives of the stranger, one thing was crystal clear to Liam. Apollo was staying right there, and this confrontation was far from resolved. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, every spectator rigid with anxiety as the stranger stood still, his gaze intensely fixed on Apollo. The dog's menacing growls echoed faintly, his body taut and ready for a confrontation. Clutching the leash firmly in both hands, Liam met the stranger's stare, his resolve mirroring the steadfast loyalty of Apollo beside him. The two figures backing the stranger remained motionless, their intimidating presence halted. The standoff seemed to extend into an eternity. Breaking the palpable silence, the judge cleared his throat, asserting his authority. This disturbance in a court of law ends now. BFFs, remove these individuals immediately. Although his voice wavered slightly, it sparked a renewed tension in the room. The BFFs approached cautiously, regaining their authority. Apollo issued another fierce bark, his teeth showing as he tracked every movement of the intruders. The stranger slowly raised his hand, signaling his followers to halt. His face changed, not to anger but to a sort of resigned acknowledgement. "This isn't finished," he stated quietly, his tone ominous. "You think it's just about the dog, but it's far more than that. You'll understand in time." He stepped back, his smirk reappearing, yet it held no warmth, just a chilling, confident calculation. "For now, I'll step back, but he is ours, Liam, and we will return." Liam's heart constricted, his hold on Apollo's leash unyielding. "He's mine alone," he declared resolutely, his voice unwavering and distinct. "And whatever you're seeking, you'll have to contend with both of us." His words landed with firm conviction, and for the first time the stranger seemed taken aback, his gaze sharpening as he gave Liam a final evaluative look. Then, without further comment, he turned and gestured for his companions to follow, exiting through the doors they had entered. The atmosphere remained tense until they were visibly gone. A heavy quiet followed their departure. Audience members cautiously resettled into their seats, murmurs cascading around as everyone attempted to digest the confrontation they had witnessed. The judge sighed deeply, his hand trembling slightly as he placed his gavel down. "This court is adjourned," he announced, his tone exhausted, barely cutting through the whispers. Yet, Liam stayed put, his gaze locked on the door. Apollo eased into a sit, his growls subsiding though his posture stayed vigilant. Liam reached down, stroking the dog's head softly. "You did good, buddy," he murmured, a mix of relief and fatigue coloring his voice. As the courtroom gradually emptied, Liam lingered, pondering the unknown man's identity and motives for wanting Apollo. This chapter might be closed for now, but Liam knew this was far from the end. Yet, with Apollo pressing against him, he allowed a brief moment of quiet relief. Together, they would face whatever came next, fortified by a bond that was utterly indomitable, a bond that no one could sever.